God's grace and peace to you, friends. This is our second week in the book of Lamentations. I hope you've taken some of those darker thoughts and moved them into joy as we further explore this text. It's good to worship together. It is good to be in the presence of one another, whether gathered or scattered, for we know that God calls us all. So let's dig into our text and worship together that we might celebrate the goodness of God.
Jesus calls us o'er the tumult of our lives, while restless seek, day by day His sweet voice sounded, saying, Christian, follow me. Jesus calls us from the worship of the vain world's golden store, from each idol that would keep us, saying, Christian, love me more. In our joys and in our sorrows, days of toil and hours of ease, still He calls us in hidden measures. Christians, love me more than these. Jesus calls us by thy mercies, Savior, may we hear thy call. Give our hearts to thine obedience, serve and love thee best of all.
Would you join me in our opening prayer? You are always with us, God, even when we are in the darkest valley. We reach out in the shadows, searching for meaning and purpose and structure, even when all we can grasp is loss. Yet even there you are with us. Remind us again today of your great love and take our hands and lead us into hope. Amen. Today's text comes from the book of Lamentations as well, chapters 3 and 5 kind of mixed together. So hear these words. I am one who has seen affliction under the rod of God's wrath. He has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Against me alone he turns his hand again and again all day long. My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is, so I say, gone is my glory, and all that I had hoped for from the Lord. The thought of my affliction and my homelessness is wormwood and gall. My soul continually thinks of it, and I am bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul that seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for one another to bear the yoke of youth, to sit alone in silence when the Lord has imposed it, to put one's mouth in the dust. There may yet be hope. To give one the cheek to the smiter and be filled with insults. For the Lord will not reject forever. Although he causes grief, he will have compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love. For he does not willingly afflict or grieve anyone. Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Look and see our disgrace. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, and our homes to aliens. We have become orphans, fatherless. Our mothers are like widows. But you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures all generations. Why have you forgotten us completely? Why have you forsaken us these many days? Restore to us yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. Here ends our reading.
My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but only lean on Jesus' name. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. When darkness veils His lovely face, I rest on His unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the veil. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. His oath, His covenant, His blood, supporting in the whelming flood. When all around my soul gives way, He then is all my hope and stay. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. When He shall come with trumpet sound, oh, may I then in Him be found. Dressed in His righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand.
So we begin with week 2 on Lamentations. Wasn't that fun last week, talking about all this? Sometimes when you come across a text, when you look at something important like this, sometimes you have to dig in a little deeper. So I want to remind you how Lamentations was written, right? Written by and for a people who had survived unimaginable trauma, personal, political, social, theological, right? And it begs the questions, what if everything you relied on for security, comfort, identity, for your sense of God's presence and hope in the world and future, simply vanished overnight? It begs the question, how do you find hope in the face of trauma? How do you keep the faith when it feels like you've been forgotten and abandoned by the divine? We're going to dig in a little bit deeper into Lamentations in this kind of the rest of the book here after we have our initial opening and talk a little bit more about how Israel dealt with that trauma beyond just naming it as Lamentations does. This section, this beginning part of Lamentations, we're drawing on books 3 and 5. We're kind of skipping 4 a little bit. It's important. It just kind of a little bit more of the same. But in this idea, this third chapter starts out with the strong man, if you will. The strong man, this idea, the archetype, if you will, of the one who is supposed to protect, who's supposed to stop the bad things from happening, the one who's going to make everything okay. I like to think of this as Superman in some way. And this Superman, this strong man, the author of this section, this voice, fails and fails spectacularly. This poet grieves not only for a lost past, but for the lost future as well. And perhaps the poet grieves for the God they thought they knew, who now seems like a stranger to them. This poet comes into the text asking the question, why, God? I was supposed to do the right thing and save us, and I didn't. And you didn't either. My guess is you've been in that spot. And it's never fun. But rarely is it just about you. I want to share part of a poem, at least, that I read recently. But I remember reading it once upon a time in a literature class circa 1996, so a couple of years back now. It's part of this poem from William Butler Yeats. It's called The Second Coming. It reads, "Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity." Yeats wrote this after the horrors of World War I, after witnessing the absolute devastation of what war is like. He tries to find meaning in the midst of this tragedy. He uses his art to try to make sense of the absolute devastation, of the feeling that everything around you is unraveling. This center he talks about is described kind of, if you will, as the everything, life, faith, God, relationships, you name it. It's as though someone took the center of your being, the rock on which you rely on, and just took it away. Yeats, as well as our author, the strong man here, the poet, seems to say something along the lines of, left to myself, the center can never hold. And even together, sometimes we have to admit that all appears lost. I'd be willing to bet you have some idea of what I'm talking about. So I want to think about a different text, but one who the author would have known these texts of lamentation, would have been part of the storytelling, the keeping. So I want you to fast forward all the way into the Gospels to think about the story of the prodigal son, right? You remember the story? Briefly, young son wants what he wants, disrespects the father and older brother, runs off making some bad decisions, comes back home, tail between his legs, and says, "Have mercy on me." And dad, instead of throwing him out, embraces him. And the older brother says, "How dare you offer him grace and mercy?" Yeah, you know the story. Maybe sometimes you're the younger son. Maybe sometimes you're the older son. Maybe sometimes you play the father in this role. But the long and the short of the story is this younger son who has blown everything, all the gifts that he has been given in life, who uses it all on poor living, as his brother and father and even himself claims. He comes to a moment and he hits what often we call rock bottom, and he comes to himself, as the text tells us. He kind of realizes what's happened and says, "I can't do this alone. What I'm doing right now is stupid. I need to change." And he begins by naming this, by coming to himself, the process of healing and ideally restoration. He basically asks the question, what if life didn't have to be this way? Hope for him, as for the strong man, appears in small ways. Not full-blown, everything's going to be okay kind of hope, but hope, just that little tiny bit, appears nonetheless amidst the struggle. It's that quick flash in a moment of darkness. It's that small break in the wave of trauma. It's that bright spot in the midst of oppressive darkness. And we're raised in the church to tell ourselves, even though I walk through the valley of death, I will fear no evil. But when you're in that valley of death, it's really hard to believe it. It's really hard not to be afraid. And so often it feels like a fake it before you make it, or until you make it scenario. And I'm going to propose to you that the strong man offers us Not all either or, but a both and situation dealing with trauma, of looking for hope. The strong man, this poet, then speaks of the beginning of hope in the midst of the trauma that they collectively and personally are experiencing. It's an interruption, dead center in the book of Lamentations, in this poem of grief and struggle and suffering. It is a strategic, decisive interpretation in the middle of this poem that declares that God's mercy is renewed every morning, even as the trauma continues. It's not that God's mercy stops it, but the awareness of God's mercy in the presence of the trauma. The poet moves from this collective and corporate loss to maybe a little bit more of a personal moment, a reflective exercise, if you will, that suggests the birth of hope in the midst of trauma and suffering and loss. Its location in the middle of this poem is not insignificant. In the 5 books of lament, there is one section that offers hope. It doesn't fix it. It doesn't stop the trauma, but it offers an alternative, a moment of clarity, a moment of looking out into the world. It's a sign to the readers of this text, to the early Israelites and the readers of today, that says, while this rejection, this trauma may feel complete and awful, and that you can't move on, it's not. That God's steadfast love is present, even when we cannot see it, even when we're positive we've been abandoned. Faith here will not believe, or does not entail believing the unbelievable out of sheer individual perseverance. It's not like if you just believe it, it'll all be okay. It's holding on to the gifts in other parts of your life, despite where your present realities are, that can call the trauma into question to say, I have been gifted by God in these ways, blessings untold. Even in the midst of this awful thing, I know God is there because God has been there before. Sometimes it's hard to remember. As for this poet in Lamentations, the faith that is required comes from the community of the people of God coming together to share their stories, to tell the ways that God has been present and the blessings have poured forth in their life, even though the present moment is tough. It comes through prayer and proclamation of God's goodness, in spite of the difficulties of the now. The poet, the strong man, calls for hope in God, not by minimizing, but by embracing and engaging and further naming the trauma and suffering. He says, even if you don't know or don't believe in God, it doesn't change the fact that God is still there. Is this easy? Of course not. It isn't. But that's why we have each other, isn't it? The work of hope in the midst of suffering happens together as God's beloved community. When you can no longer bear your burdens, that's when the beloved community of God surrounds you and helps you carry that load. Not takes the load, helps you carry your load until you can carry it again yourself. The poet then offers this moment of hope before he goes right back into the despair and trauma. He says, great is thy faithfulness, O God. You know that hymn. In a moment, like the Psalms say, to be still and know that God is present. And yet, the strong man goes right back into the trauma, into this wave of despair and hope, and despair and hope in the seemingly never-ending cycle of our life. But maybe this is the point. When you have that moment of clarity, or you have that moment where you come to yourself like the prodigal son, you open yourself to the grace and the mercy of God and this beloved community in your midst. It's so you don't forget the goodness of God that is surrounded in God's creation of the world and the people around you. Does it fix everything? Of course not. But it's a start. You call it and claim your pain. You use your beloved, whether it be close to you or corporately, to help you bury and carry and let go and move forward, or maybe just to let the scar heal enough that you can keep moving. It's not a fix-all, but it's a start. The psalmist sings in Psalm 73, "Nevertheless, I am completely with you. You hold my hand." That even in the midst of the worst parts of life, in the darkest of days and times, that you have not been abandoned, that you will not be abandoned by God or the beloved community that God has placed in your path. May you know that no matter what or how or why, or no matter what anyone else tells you in this world, that you are a beloved child of God. That no matter how dark it seems, there is light when we can reach and not try to bury or carry, not try to push down or hide, but when we can together acknowledge our trauma and together look to the hope that can bring new life in the midst of those dark times, because you are not alone and never will be alone, because God is always with you. Amen.
When I walk through deep waters, I know that you will be with me. When I'm standing in the fire, I will not be overcome. Through the valley of the shadow, I will not fear. I am not alone. I am not alone. You go before me. You will never leave me. I am not alone. I am not alone. You go before me. You will never leave me. In the midst of deep sorrow, I see your light is breaking through. The dark of night will not overtake me. I am pressing into you. Lord, you find my every battle, and I will not fear. I am not alone. I am not alone. You will go before me. You will never leave me. I am not alone. I am not alone. You will go before me. You will never leave me. You amaze me, you redeem me, you call me as your own. You amaze me, you redeem me, you call me as your own. You're my strength, you're my defender, you're my refuge in the storm. Through these trials, you've always been faithful. You bring healing to my soul.
Would you join me in prayer? God, we give thanks. We give thanks that your steadfast love never ceases, that your mercies never come to an end. We give thanks that your faithfulness is great. We give thanks that you would call us all by name, that you would know us, that you would consider us your beloved. We give thanks that no matter how dark the times may seem, you are ever with us. Your Spirit surrounds us. Your Son is a light in that darkness. We give thanks for the communities of care that surround us, for the ways that your beloved community is grown and loves and offers grace and mercy and forgiveness to all. Help us to lead in your example, to walk that path that would call us to be our better selves. Fill us with your grace, not for our benefit, but that we might pour it out on this world. Give us courage for the facing of these days. Let us be angels to those who need us most. And most importantly, let us be filled with your love, your compassion, your kindness, your mercy, and your forgiveness. May we be an example to the world of what it may be to live in your beloved community filled with love. We give thanks for these gifts, and so it is that we join together in the prayer that you taught us to pray, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen.